Welcome to Gender Chronicles. Dive into the fascinating world of gender dynamics as we unravel the threads of tradition, change, and identity. Together, we'll explore the intricate relationships between the sexes, empowering you to navigate them with clarity, confidence, and insight. Today, we will do something a little different. We will read you a short story about the fate of Western civilization, driven over the cliff by excesses of feminist ideology. The short story is called The Future Without Men. Let us begin. It began slowly in the West, as most things do, a quiet unraveling that no one noticed until the seams had split wide open. In the beginning, it was just a whisper. In schools, on street corners, in anonymous forums where angry boys sought refuge from a world that didn't seem to care about them. They spoke in low voices, fractured thoughts spilling out like broken glass, cutting but incomplete. There were no headlines, no protests, no grief from a society distracted by other causes, and so the silence grew. But as the years passed, something strange began to happen. A dullness fell over the young men of the West, a collective stillness that hung in the air like a fog. It was not laziness or disobedience, for these would have been signs of vitality, sparks of rebellion in a world on fire. No, what people saw was far worse. It was a retreat, a quiet exodus from life itself. Boys did not vanish in dramatic rebellion. They simply faded, step by quiet step, into the shadows. At first, parents thought their sons were simply tired. "It's the video games," they said. "It's too much screen time." Teachers blamed distraction. Politicians blamed everything and nothing at all. But the boys, they didn't fight back. They sat in dark rooms, staring at ceilings or screens or out into nothing at all. Their voices fell to murmurs. Their eyes turned hollow. Somewhere deep within, a quiet resignation had taken hold. They were the hollow generation. No one knew exactly when the suicides began to spike. The numbers climbed so gradually that no one felt the panic they should have felt. At first, the deaths were written off as anomalies, blips in the data. But soon enough, their frequency became too great to ignore. Funeral homes overflowed. Small towns saw their boyhood populations reduced by half. Entire high schools became ghostly halls of mourning. Still, society refused to say it aloud, that something was killing the sons of the West. And so the world pressed on, silently burying its boys. The gynocentric social order. In those years before the collapse, society had become increasingly gynocentric. Every speech, every law, every program seemed to orbit the needs and interests of women and girls. Girls' education was prioritized, their struggles amplified, their victories celebrated. Meanwhile, the boys' quiet descent into despair was brushed aside. Boys' natural ways of learning, their need to move, to explore, to test boundaries, were pathologized. Schools became temples of stillness and compliance. Sitting still for hours, reading endless texts, and regurgitating information were held up as the gold standard of education, an education designed for the studious focus that came more naturally to girls. When boys fidgeted, fought, or fell behind, they were told to sit still, to quiet down, to apologize for what they were. Libraries too changed. Bright shelves filled with colorful stories about empowered girls and fearless women lined every wall. There were no stories of adventurers or warriors, no tales of wild boys fighting dragons or building ships. Boys who looked for themselves in books found nothing but ghosts. Teachers gently corrected their curiosities. "Try reading about her, she's the real hero here." And so the boys stopped reading. Then they stopped trying. The few boys who resisted did so with anger. They turned desks over, ran wild in playgrounds, shouted in hallways. And for this, they were diagnosed. ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder. They were medicated, disciplined, and isolated. Their energy was seen as a threat, their wildness something to be tamed. The world did not understand that these were the last sparks of life in a generation slipping away. College became the final gate that slammed shut. As the years passed, campuses filled with women, sharp-eyed and purposeful. Women accounted for 60% of graduates, sometimes more. The schools celebrated the numbers, heralding progress. Meanwhile, the boys disappeared. Scholarships for girls abounded. Grants for women in STEM multiplied. But nothing was offered to boys who had fallen so far behind they had no hope of catching up. "It's their male privilege," the world said. "Boys will be fine." But they weren't fine. They vanished from lecture halls and libraries, from debates and student unions. They vanished from society itself, and the world barely noticed until it was too late. The year of the Big Sister. The year of the Big Sister, the West had become an iron cage. The Feminist Party, also known as the F Party, in its infinite wisdom, had decreed that equality required vigilance. The smart screens were installed on every wall, their unblinking gaze a fixture in homes, offices, and schools alike. The F Party had decreed with iron certainty, every man, every woman, every child, no matter how young or old, must possess a party phone, a device both gift and tether, always at hand, always ready to be answered on the first shrill note of its call. The smart screens and party phones were twins of the machine, seamlessly synced, their voices intruding without invitation to broadcast the party's commands, truths, and denouncements. In their glow, privacy flickered out like the last breath of a dying flame. These devices, which could not be turned off, were the eyes, ears, and mouths of the F Party. They watched, listened, recorded, and catalogued every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression. And they spoke relentlessly, flooding the air with messages of unity, harmony, and the righteousness of the Big Sister's rule. It was for the good of all, or so they said. But beneath the smiling posters and the endless broadcasts, a shadow grew. Whispers of discontent spread, voices that dared to question why the boys were disappearing, why classrooms were half empty of their laughter, why the young men staggered through life like ghosts. The F Party's slogans were unyielding. Progress is justice, sacrifice is strength, and above all, equality above all. But what the smart screens and party phones never explained was why the statistics of despair skewed so sharply male. The suicide rates were dismissed as anomalies. The dropout rates were declared to be the fault of the boys themselves. And those who raised their voices to ask, to plead for answers, were swiftly silenced. The smart screens and party phones were the F Party's weapons of choice. They did not merely listen, they projected and played on. Each home became an indoctrination cell. Bright-eyed lecturers explained why society had finally reached the pinnacle of fairness, while psychologists calmly described how dissatisfaction was a sign of privilege, a trait to be rooted out like a weed. The F Party's truth was absolute. There was no plight of boys and young men, only their pathological nature and resistance to progress. The first dissidents, the first to question, were not revolutionaries. They were teachers, mothers, and quiet men who wrote timid letters to the local councils. "Why are the boys failing?" they asked. "Can we do something to help them?" Their questions were not accusations, but cries for understanding. The twin devices noticed. Within days, the letters stopped arriving. The mothers were summoned to community engagement centers, where F Party officials patiently explained that their concerns were unfounded. "Your son is fortunate," they would say. "He must learn to appreciate the opportunities he has been given." The teachers were re-educated and rehabilitated, made to attend seminars on gender-based equitable teaching practices, where they learned to redirect their empathy toward the girls, whose needs were, of course, more urgent. For the men, the consequences were harsher. A mechanic named Corwin, who had asked why his apprentices all quit before finishing their training, was arrested for disrupting social harmony. His trial lasted 7 minutes. He was sent to the Center for Restoration, where he was made to watch telescreen broadcasts for 16 hours a day until his will broke. When he was released, he returned to his garage, but he spoke to no one. The underground. As the repression grew, the dissidents were driven underground. They called their refuge the Manosphere. It was not a place, but a web of hidden networks and encrypted forums, where men and women, the few who dared to see, shared their stories. The Manosphere was fragmented, its members distrustful, for the telescreens were everywhere. Betrayal could come from a careless word, a wayward glance, or an agent provocateur lurking behind a friendly username. The Manosphere spoke of the missing boys, the broken men, and the women who mourned them. They whispered about fathers turned into visitors by family courts, about schools that treated boys as defective girls, about a world that had forgotten its sons. Some wrote manifestos, others composed songs, and a few organized small acts of defiance. Graffiti on party slogans, encrypted leaflets slipped under doors. The Big Sister's F Party responded with fury. The smart screen and party phone broadcasts declared the Manosphere a toxic conspiracy, its members dangerous reactionaries bent on destroying progress. New surveillance measures were implemented. Homes were searched. Those caught with forbidden writings were subjected to public alignment sessions. These sessions, broadcast live, showed dissidents confessing their misguided views, tears streaming down their faces as they begged for forgiveness. The lucky ones were merely humiliated. Others were sent to the camps. Discipline and punishment. The camps were where dissidents were remade. There, under the unblinking gaze of the twin devices, they were subjected to rigorous re-education. They were made to chant F-Party slogans until their voices cracked, to write essays on the dangers of male privilege, and to confess their pathological male-think urges before panels of grim-faced feminist officials. Some broke quickly, their spirits crushed under the weight of constant scrutiny. Others resisted, and for them there were darker methods. Corporal discipline was forbidden, officially. However, the F-Party's methods did not need fists or whips. The twin devices in the camps played endless loops of propaganda, their voices invading every corner of the mind. Prisoners were kept in isolation. Their only human contact was the interrogators, who asked them again and again why they hated equality. Sleep was a rare mercy, denied to those who resisted. When the prisoners emerged, they were shadows of themselves, their eyes dull, their voices mechanical. The F-Party called it rehabilitation. The Manosphere called it something else: annihilation. The last broadcast. One night, a single message appeared on the twin devices across the West. It was brief, just a flicker between the Feminist Party's endless proclamations. "We see you, we hear you. The of the West will rise again." The F-Party's response was immediate and brutal. Sweeps were conducted across every city, every town. Entire neighborhoods were locked down. Those suspected of dissent, those who had paused too long at the message or failed to denounce it with sufficient fervor, were arrested en masse. In the Manosphere, panic spread. Some networks were wiped out entirely. Others went deeper underground, their members disappearing into the digital void. The Big Sister herself appeared on the twin devices the next morning. Her voice was calm, her smile unshaken. "The West is united in its purpose," she declared, "and unity is strength. Those who would divide us will find no refuge here. Let this be a warning to all." But the warning did not silence the whispers. In the shadows, in the cracks of the F-Party's facade, the Manosphere endured. Its members knew the cost of resistance. They knew they might not live to see the change they dreamed of. But they also knew this: the twin devices could not watch forever. No matter how deeply buried, the truth has a way of rising, and so they waited. The price of success. Meanwhile, it had become common for young women to emerge from college with degrees and ambition. They stepped into boardrooms, hospitals, and laboratories. They bought houses, earned promotions, and sat at dinner tables with friends, toasting their success. Yet beneath their laughter, a quiet discontent hummed. "Where are the men?" they asked. It was true. They could not find them. For every accomplished woman, there were fewer men who matched her standards. It was not just about education or money. It was about vitality, purpose, ambition. The men were simply gone, dead, defeated, or drifting. A strange bitterness crept into the air. Women who had been told they could have it all, career, love, and family, found themselves alone. The few men who remained earned less than they did, moved slower than they did. These men did not inspire love, they inspired disappointment. The women scrolled endlessly through dating apps, swiping left until the screens turned grey. "Why can't they keep up with us?" they wondered aloud. Matchmakers called it a crisis. Millions of women competed for a dwindling number of men who could make more, do more, be more. The scarcity of the male gender had ignited a silent, savage war among women. The once invisible lines of camaraderie were now battlefronts, each woman a solitary warrior, her survival dependent on outmaneuvering her rivals. The tender bonds of sisterhood were replaced by a cold, calculating rivalry. Every glance, every word, every gesture was a potential weapon, a subtle jab in the relentless pursuit of a dwindling prize. With increasing desperation, tensions escalated into a war of attrition, primal and unrelenting. Each woman saw in the other a threat to her survival, her claim, her future. The world had turned them into scavengers in a wasteland, fighting over the last embers of a dwindling fire. The women who secured partners clung to them with a mix of triumph and torment, their joy metamorphosing into resentment almost as swiftly as it bloomed. They knew, oh, they knew that the fragile threads binding man to woman could not hold. Masculine presence, once the steady rhythm of society, had become a phantom, craved yet unattainable, its scarcity a cruel joke. Their deepest desire had become a cruel mirage, shimmering briefly before vanishing into the void. Even in possession, they lived in dread of loss, for the men they held were never truly theirs, only fleeting shadows in a world stripped of permanence. The ones who didn't turned inward, lonely and confused. "Why didn't anyone tell us this would happen?" they whispered. The vials, once vessels of hope, lay empty. The silent hum of the cryogenic tanks, a mournful dirge in the sterile laboratory. Women, their futures etched in the promise of science, now faced a barren landscape. The sperm banks, once brimming with life's potential, were now desolate wastelands. The donors vanished into the swirling chaos, leaving behind a legacy of broken dreams. The machines, once guardians of genetic heritage, now rusted and inert, their life-sustaining energy extinguished. The collapse of schools. The education system, once the pride of the West, crumbled first. Schools began closing at an alarming rate. It was not a lack of funding, it was a lack of students. Boys had dropped out, and girls, despite their academic success, were fewer in number. The classrooms sat empty, their silence heavy with the weight of abandonment. The system had become a temple without worshippers, a relic of a society that once thrived. Some boys, now men, wandered through the ruins of schools. They traced their fingers across the walls where colorful letters had once been pinned. In the playgrounds, rusted swings swayed gently, the laughter of children replaced by the wind. "They told me I was broken," one man whispered. "All I ever needed was to move, to build, to be something real. But they made me sit. They told me I was wrong." The female reckoning. The crisis rippled outward. Women had been told that independence was their birthright, but now they found themselves burdened. The homes they bought were empty. The money they earned brought little joy. Their achievements were hollow without someone to share them with. Some resented the men who had disappeared. Others mourned for what had been taken from them. In small towns and large cities, women gathered in cafes and homes. They spoke in hushed voices, confessing truths they had never said aloud. "I want to stop. I don't want to keep climbing, keep earning. I just want a partner. I want a family. I thought they'd be here." But the men were not there. And when they were broken, unwilling or unable to take up the roles women had been promised. The final silence. In the end, the world fell silent. Without men to build, fix, or fight, society began to collapse. Power grids flickered and died. Bridges cracked and crumbled. Food grew scarce. The cities, once bustling with ambition, became hollow, overgrown ruins. Women wandered through the emptiness, searching for something they could not name. In the final days, the last boys, those who had been born into a world that hated them, vanished. Some retreated into wildernesses, building fires that no one saw. Others lay down in the ruins of classrooms and homes, whispering apologies for simply being what they were. And the women, having climbed the ladders of success only to find them leading nowhere, stared out at the broken world and asked themselves the question that would never be answered. Why didn't we see this coming? The silence swallowed everything. The aftermath. In the end, the last remnants of society were a patchwork of isolated communities, each struggling to survive amidst the ruins of their former glory. Women who had spent their lives striving to prove their worth now turned to subsistence farming, weaving and rebuilding. Their hands, once adorned with polished nails and holding tablets, were now calloused and cracked from hard labor. They did not speak of the men anymore, though they thought of them often, of the brothers, fathers and sons who might have shared the burdens now crushing their shoulders. And in the wilderness, the last of the men, a scattered, broken tribe, roamed aimlessly. Some built crude shelters, others lived alone in caves or among the ruins of industrial plants. They no longer spoke to one another. There were no fireside stories, no shared meals, just silence, deep and consuming, as they waited for the end. The earth itself began to reclaim what was left of humanity. Forests crept over highways, rivers washed away bridges, and animals returned to places they had long abandoned. And somewhere in this wild, indifferent world, the echoes of a forgotten generation faded completely. Humanity had conspired against its own sons, and in doing so sealed its fate. The silence was absolute, the future erased. So what do you think? If you found this video thought-provoking or inspiring, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to hit the share or like button and subscribe to stay connected. Got a topic on your mind? Share your ideas with us.